One of the advantages of practicing sword fighting and practicing something like HEMA is that the difference between good and worse, or better and worse, is whether or not you avoid getting smacked in the head with a training sword. I find that intellectually awesome. During the Middle Ages, there were people who wrote down manuals for fighting, similar to the way you can get books on how to do karate now. Now the question is, how do you learn from a book how to do karate? It's difficult. It's not exactly the same as having an instructor. You can't be corrected on technique, and there's a limit to how much you can actually learn. You can learn a lot though. My friend Joseph has actually learned a number of kung fu forms solely from the internet and watching videos. It can be done. So how can it be done well? I was first introduced to the Scholastic method, which is this medieval model of education, through an essay called The Scholastic Method in I-33, which is reference to a sword fighting text. The interesting thing about this manuscript, the I-33, is that it's written out of order. There are pictures together with the text that show you the moves. So first you've got your buckler here and your sword here, and then your buckler's under your arm and you're ready, and you've got all these positions and they seem to follow a sequence. So first I do this, then that guy does this, and then I do this, but it goes out of order. The first move is followed by the second move, and if you want to get number 3, you have to turn to page 12. Oh, and they're not marked. So how is it exactly that you're going to learn from this? Well, so goes the theory written in this essay that the model to be used with this text was the Scholastic method, which is a method of medieval instruction which consists of these steps. In this model, you have a text and you ponder it and you break it down into its constituent elements. This is analysis, breaking down into pieces, followed by synthesis. You're creating something yourself. You're bringing a proposal to the table. The Scholastic method, in many ways, is very similar to the scientific method. You bring your theory. Now it's time for the stress test. After you have broken down this original work, constructed something of your own, you bring it to the table to be discussed and torn to shreds. After that, you will know what survived, what parts of your theory, what parts of your creation made it. And then you go for round 2. This process can be iterated multiple times with the same text and still have you as a student growing, becoming, increasing. Now you bring that to the sword fighting book. In order to get all of these pictures in order so that you understand the order of operations, so that you understand the sequence of a fight, you need to be watching through this manuscript with an extremely critical eye. You need to be looking and saying, well, that doesn't make sense. His guard's too low. He's going to get chopped in the head. You might be right. As a student, you have to bring a level of conjecture to this. You look at the book and you say, okay, I'm not sure if this makes sense. And it's just deliberately confusing enough that I have a permission to doubt it, to bring my critical eye with just a little bit more fury to the text. Then you test your theory. You test it in the ring. You test it with training swords. And then you get walloped in the side of the head and say, I'm not sure that my interpretation is correct. However, in the end, after taking all of these pictures out of order, learning them backwards and forwards by heart with a fair amount of memorization, and then reconstructing them in the order that you think they should go, you as a student have the capacity, the potential through this process to become a peer with the person who wrote it. In this, you're never kind of capped underneath the umbrella of an instructor who's always telling you how to do it properly. With this one, the critical eye that you bring together with this synthesis and testing done over and over in an iterative fashion, you are able to hopefully rise to the level of a peer, to see things that the instructor who wrote the text maybe didn't, to understand it in a very visceral, very complete form. This method has become deeply unpopular because of its heavy reliance on memorization. And the thing about memorization is that it can easily become rote and false, where it's just regurgitating something that you've been given. But combining that memorization for the ownership that it gives you, together with the extremely critical eye, which in this case is explicitly prompted by deliberately putting the pictures out of order, you have to bring a critical eye. There's no way to read it uncritically and still get something out of it. In the modern martial art of HEMA, historical European martial arts, this is one of the central challenges. There are no living instructors. There are no living masters who can teach you how to fight with, say, a sword and buckler like in the Tower of Fight manuscript. But in order to grapple with these texts, these 400, 500, 600-year-old texts which teach you how to do something that requires a certain amount of hands-on practical knowledge, we have to engage as scholars first to be able to deconstruct, reconstruct, and then aggressively stress test in hand-to-hand combat to see if our interpretations work. I find that intellectually awesome. The discussion phase of this model is particularly interesting because it requires you to see better and worse, not perfect and good enough. The thing that is interesting about peer discussion is that you're able to identify, that's a weak argument, or that's not quite as good, or even if your peers can't tell you exactly why. Now, one of the advantages of practicing sword fighting and practicing something like HEMA is that the difference between good and worse, or better and worse, is whether or not you avoid getting smacked in the head with a training sword. The criterion for what is good are really pretty easy to see. Does it work? Does it work consistently? Does it work with different opponents at different skill levels? Does it work when you're not expecting something? Can you pull it off generally? Is it a one-trick sort of situation where you can get it to work the first time you go up against someone and not the second and third time? You know, these are all things that you will find out after having constructed something yourself and offered it to discussion with your peers. And your peers will tell you, in the case of sword fighting, they will tell you quite vigorously what they think of your interpretation. Similarly, in discussion of the written word and discussion of ideas, the standards are not as easy to articulate, and maybe they're not as easy to even feel. It's not quite like a training sword smacked to the side of the head. But you can still detect better and worse. One thing that is worth pondering, if you're going to focus and really digest material to this level that is required by the Scholastic method, is you need to be really picky about the texts. You need to find something that is worth reading not just once, but read backwards, forwards, semi-memorized, absorbed into the skin, into the core of your being, and then reconstructed and molded into something really worth making a part of yourself. Which means you need to be pretty picky. In the words of Sir Francis Bacon, some books are to be tasted, a few are to be devoured, and some few are intended to be chewed and digested. As a student in law school, in the early 20th century, there were some intentions to try to move back to something similar to the Scholastic method. Holding this as a model, we adopted something that Oliver Wendell Holmes called the Socratic method. Now, this is vaguely similar, but in many ways it's watered down and it misses some of the key point. Because here the idea is read all of your law texts, and then once you get to class, the instructor, the law professor, will start grilling students and say, "You, third from the back, tell me all the details about this case." That gets some of it, but it doesn't give enough time for digestion, because you move on to a new set of cases the next week, and the level of analysis in the law, particularly in the era of statute that we're currently in, is very low. The bar that we're looking for is, do you understand the facts of the case and do you understand the rule that came out of this particular decision? There, you're done. However, in order for this to be really comparable with the Scholastic method of old, you need to be absorbing principles. The principles are the thing that you're looking for. After having digested this case, memorized the facts of it, learned it backwards and forwards, this far we can agree in the Socratic method and the Scholastic method, the next level is to deconstruct and to create a new one. So, in order to do that in law school, you'd have to have students writing their version of a decision for the same fact scenario. You'd have to have them practicing the art of judgment in addition to the art of memorizing the case. And then you would have to bring a debate, which we don't have time for in law school, where you compared each other's decisions to see who has a better grasp of the raw principles on which you can rest case law. In the modern era, we rely so heavily on statute that this would be largely irrelevant. Case law, in many senses, is considered to be a thing of the past, something that is used to fill in gaps where statutes weren't quite wise enough to see everything. But as a student, I can't help but feel that I'm getting the dregs of something deeper and older, something that is a shadow of what once was and could be. And I feel that my education has suffered as a result. If I want to really experience the Scholastic method, my impression is that I would have to do it myself. I'd have to arrange to find a master and a discussion group and a book club or something to that effect. Or perhaps YouTube is a good analogy for this, especially since it's an iterative enough process. I mean, a video is made and then others make response videos, and there seems to be a real conversation happening online here. Maybe that's where education is going. But in order to do that, you have to not just be absorbing, but also constructing and stress testing. In the case of reading law, if you were to be in the business of constructing your own judicial opinions from the same fact scenario and say, this is how I would determine it, and this is the rule of law that would come out of that, if you were to bring that to your peers, they would be able to detect the justice in terms of better and worse very easily. That would come out in the discussion. The thing that I like about this model, the Scholastic method, is that it trains your ability to distinguish better and worse. And in the end, that's what makes a master. It's someone who has, a repository of knowledge that they have developed, but the repository of knowledge isn't that impressive. You can get that in a book. The thing that makes a master valuable, particularly in something like the martial arts, is their ability to detect subtleties of better and worse. They have a more refined eye. It's not so much the mind, we don't care so much about that, it's the eye. Can you see when I'm doing it right? Can you see what's going to cause me problems down the line? Can you see better and worse? This is the thing that personally I think education is about. Are we developing the ability to see clearly in terms of better and worse? In terms of true and false as well, but in the end, why do we care about truth? It's because it's better than falsehood. So the core I think is, can you detect the difference between better and worse? If this video was worth your time, please consider hitting the like button and subscribe below. As always, thank you, and we'll see you next time. Ha! 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 You're killing me.